we presented with 4 mitzvahs, which are called Eilchin. And the first is Elkei Odom, spoke about last week. That's Kuf. Kuf Yudalid. Kuf Tesvov is Elkei Behema Tmeya, which we spoke about last week. But the truth is a very odd thing because the Ram says the mitzvah is Elkei Behema Tmeya. And the Pirush Makubal, it's very clear as a Pirush Makubal because the Ram himself in Pirush Mishnayos Menochos in Perigid Beis Mishnah Aleph says Bo Bekabbalah Sheposik Zeh Eino Elo Bebali Mumen Sheyiftu. So I assume what happened is the general cloud which he developed many times in Sefer HaMitzvos, that the Pirush Makubal is not coming to be moitzi from Pshuta B'Shal Mikra, but it's in addition to. So since the Pshuta B'Shal Mikra is Behemet Tmeya, so the Ram could say that the mitzvah is called Behemet Tmeya. The more interesting thing is that in Mishnah Torah, he says, Elkei Behema in Protei Mitzvahs, which I assume the Rambam is of the opinion, as he says in Mishnah Torah, that if you makdish a Behema, Tehera, Tmima, Leberek Abayis, there's opinion of Hamod Varocha. Hamod Varocha means that the behemoth has to be alive when the kohen evaluates it. It's not that he has to stand the behemoth, but he has to be roy to stand. And if you're dead, you're not roy lamud. So once you accept Mishnah Torah, l'chayra, it comes out that the whole idea of behemoth tmeira is completely out of context, and it's any behemoth kodesh which you do opinion on, you require modar alochu, it's kodesh mizbeach, kodesh berek habayis. Whether the Rambam is not ready to accept it over here because it's not pshuta shel mikra, the pshuta mikra is behemoth tmeya, or whether there's an Mitzvas Aseh to makdish behema tmima, the berek habayis, it's not clear, but the here it seems to be the mitzvah behemoth tmeya. And in Mishnah Torah, he says, Erke Behema Stam. And also he clearly says in Mishnah Torah, in Perek Ha'aloch Yud Beis, Kol Matis Bein B'chayel, Bein Torah, Bein Tmeya, Bein Kodesh Habayis, Perek Kodesh Habayis, Bein Kodesh Mizbeach, Shnoch Boi Mum, Oy Tmimo, Really Kolev, Kmo She's Boy, Harizu Tzricha Hamod Avarocha, Bebezdin, Shenever Behemines Behema. Okay. That is the mitzvah of Hamod Avarocha. And not the mitzvah of Hamod Avarocha, the mitzvah is to Erki, to give this erech to Hektish. And there's a peculiar din how you evaluate the erech. It has to be Erki Koyin through Hamod Avarocha. The fact that it knows the scene, that's the Lashon Rambam in the Minyan HaKotzer. Lios Hamarich Neisen. Kuf Tezayin. He is also strange. The mitzvah is Hishitivonu Be'erke Batim. Now, it is true that there's a parsha in the Torah of Be'erke Batim. And that's the Ram says, Ishkiach, which is based on Kodesh, Lashem, Verichu HaKoyin, requires Harochas Koyin. But if you look at the Rambam, very clearly in Perek Hey of Hilchos Erchem V'Chalomim, Halacha Gimel, Amakdish is beisoi, oi es behema tmeya shaloi, o shal metaltlin, hari elu nerocha b'shavein bein toiv u'bein ra. Bein poda is amakdish, o ishta yosher luisichoy. So the Rambam, when he's talking, he doesn't talk about a mitzvah of Elkei Batim. He does talk about it in the beginning, in the Protei mitzvahs, but when he formulates the Aloch and Perikei Aloch Gimel, he puts Elkei Beis, Bayis, and Behemoth Tmeya and Shama Taltum together. So I understand that Behemoth Tmeya is different because it's a posik, and not only is a posik, there are different dinim of Hamad of Alocha. We'll see later. Batim doesn't require Hamad of Alocha. But what does metaltalin have to do over here? So I assume because metaltalin have the same din as batim. And basically Behem has the same din as batim as metaltalin. It's just there's a peculiar halacha in the evaluation. And that peculiar din in the evaluation makes it a separate mitzvah. And metaltalin, which are not formulated in Torah Shabbat, the Torah only talks about bayis, ish kiyakish beis kodesh. So there's a mitzvah of batim, and there's also a mitzvah of behemoth tmeya. But there's no mitzvah of metaltalin because the Torah Shabbat does not discuss it. And especially Siddur Shalano, because the Ram says. See here, so the Ram says in the beginning of Kuf Tesvav, Kuf Yudalid, and Kuf Yudzayin, he says that it's a Shirano, that it's religious legislation. There's no tzibur in the Torah. So I would have said that the whole reason it's a mitzvah because the Torah discusses it, and it's osak bo, bedan bo, as the Ram says in Sadi Hey. So the whole reason this is a mitzvah is only in as much that the Torah talks about it. Besides, we have Sherish Beis, that mitzvahs only Torah Shabbat. However, there is a monkey wrench here, because peculiarly this mitzvah, we don't understand why. When the Ram says over here, Shetivonu, Be'erke Batim, so the Ram says, Alma Amalno, that's a bona fide tzibur. So that you can't begin to talk about Shema. But however, you have no clear clue of why this is an Amal and not a Shirano. And more so, the Rambam in Protei mitzvahs, the beginning of Ilchos Erechin, the mitzvah is, as he says like this, the mitzvah is like this. Protei mitzvahs Hilchos Erechin v'Charomim. Aleph lo dun be'erkei Odom, kasher mefurish b'Torah, v'zeh din erkei Odom, din erkei behema, din erkei batim, din erkei sodos. So it's very clear that it's a din. So we don't understand over here b'chlal why the Rambam discusses over here that it's amal. So I would assume that it's almost like we says in Sadi Hey. If you look in Sadi Hey, in the Mitzvah Fosadon, the Ram goes back and forth and calls it Esh Amal and then says it's Shirano, because as far as Minyan HaMitzvah is concerned, it's the same. So maybe the Ram is only trying to tell you that it's irrelevant in terms of Minyan HaMitzvah whether it's Amal or Shirano. But Lemaisa in Mishnah Torah clearly says that it's religious legislation, not a bona fide commandment. Here, he doesn't say it like that. The question is it bedafkana? Next. Now, Kuf Yud Zayin. That was just to give us background, really to go into Kuf Yud Zayin. Kuf Yud Zayin Mitzvah Hasheva Shvaisrei Umeya he Mash Tzipsonu Atera, which is the Shana, Be'erkei Sodos. V'hu Omroi V'im Mistei Achuzosa V'goyim. V'im Estei Miknosai Asher Mistei Achuzosa V'chulei. So the Ram clearly is trying to do is tell you, he defines the mitzvah of Sodos, undefined, and he leaves it undefined because he wants the word Sodos over here to really refer to two things. Not only stay achuza, but also stay mikneh. V'im mistei achuzasai, v'im estei miknosai sheloi mistei achuzasai. So what he's trying to tell you is that this mitzvah, this stay achuza and stay mikneh, they're all one mitzvah in your mitzvahs, and it's called the mitzvah of Elkei Sodos. When you makdish it, you have to be marich. You have to evaluate the soda, and then you give the money to hektish as pidyon. The May pidyon goes to hektish. Now here, we'll get back. We'll talk about this slowly but surely. But there's a very interesting word over here. In Ibn Tibin, it says v'chein b'stei achuza, which we don't understand what v'chein means. In Kapach, and the word in the Arabic is chacham, which means to be done. And it says that the Torah is done in Stei Achuza, and the conclusion in Stei Achuza is V'hoye elkecho lefi zaloi, and it's done in Stei Mikno, and the conclusion is V'chishiv lo yaklin es michsas or elkef. So there are two different ways of evaluating, and the Torah points these two different ways out. V'don, or the Torah is megala to us the different mishpatim, the mishpatim of Stei Achuza, V'hoye elkecho lefi zaloi, and in Stei Mikne, V'choshev yaklin es michsas nefoshes. Michas ha'elkecho. See here, it's very strange. The Rambam now, let's continue. The Rambam now, because boy mishpatei mitzvazu, al shleimus mitzvazu, al shleimus miseres erchim. V'al yachshav choyshe, she'elu arba minim, v'ha'erchin yiyeh b'neim shitu. V'yichayiv she'imnu mitzvah achas, because they're all called Eilchin. Avoheim Arba Mitzvahs. Yesh L'kol Achas Mehen Din Zuas Din Acheres. So why is it 4 mitzvahs? Because each one has its peculiar din. Now then it says V'omnom, which is a very poor translation. It should probably be, it should be, this Arabic word, Anma, he has in Samach Vav, I say Samach Vav, and it means Eino Elo. So it means, L'chel over here, you should translate, even Kappa doesn't do it exactly like that, but he translated like that in Samach Vav. What you should probably do is say like this, V'einoi koilom b'shem erech ela outside shita Hashem. So the word erech doesn't define its essence to make it one mitzvah, but it just has common qualities, a commonality that we're talking about value. Because why? Because they're different dinim. Okay, that's the rule which he said there. So the amazing thing in the mitzvah, which he has laid down this rule, that the kvius is really a kvius of dinim shoinim, and elke behema tmeya is a separate mitzvah, even though the dinim are the same as elke batim, but the way you evaluate it, the kohen is a separate din, is evaluation, and it has to be royal amod barocha, and the being royal amod barocha is a separate din, and makes it a separate mitzvah from elke batim. Otherwise, elke batim and elke behemoth meir would have been one mitzvah. Elke Odom has its method of evaluation. The Torah has a sheer kotzu for each different age and each different sex, whether it's man or woman. That's also different dinim. But doesn't the Torah also have different dinim of how much you mechuyev and stay achuza and stay mikna? And if that's true, so shouldn't it be two separate mitzvahs? The same way, okay, you see here, there's a whole different way of evaluation. And okay, saw this and in our stay achuza and stay mikna. In behema, tmeya, and batim, there's no real difference. It's just the way that you need royal amod barocha in the evaluation. But the evaluation is the same in batim and behema. And that's enough to make it two mitzvahs. So here also, it should be two mitzvahs. And in the place where the Rambam has this rule, that it depends upon dinim shainim, he says that it's one mitzvah. It's an amazing thing. So here, I would tell you like this. It says like this. The Rambam in Minyan HaKotzer, then we'll go back and we'll see the dinim. He says like this. In Minyan HaKotzer, he does an amazing thing. Litain kuf yud zayin Minyan HaKotzer, litain makdish sadehu elko ho'amur batera shenema im mistei achuzosai. So how do you do that? I understand the Minyan Mitzvah Kotzer, but to mention one and it say it's elko ho'amur batera and not to mention the second one and the Fuya Yoitze is an amazing thing. And it's difficult to say that he changed the definition because the definition in Mishnah Torah is the same definition he is in Minyan HaMitzvos. The mitzvah is Chatev Shetzivso Be'erkei Sodos, and in Minyan HaKotzer, in Protei HaMitzvos in Mishnah Torah, in Hilchos Erchin, Din Erkei Sodos. So it's an odd thing. So I would have said that what the Ram's doing over here is being megala to us that even in stay mikne, it's ke'elka hakosa b'Torah. See, look at the lashon. He says in Kuf Yud Zayin, Litein makdish sodeu elko ho'amur b'Torah shneim aviim mistei achuz aseh. So I think what the Ram is trying to tell you is that this din that the Torah says that you evaluate it, and it says v'chishav, the Torah says in Perich Chav Zayin in Vayiko pasuk Chav Gimel Chav Daled, v'chishav lo yakrin es michsas ha'elkocho ad shnas hayovel v'nosan es ha'elkocho bayom ahu kodesh l'Hashem b'shnas hayovel yoshu v'asodeh l'asher kono meitoi l'asher lo yachuzas ha'oretz. So it's a very interesting way. The question, how do you flip it? Do you say that since it's a din yovel, so immediately the elka b'shuk is only until yovel? Or no? That basically, since the Torah has said that it's going to be, the evaluation is, as it says the evaluation is going to be v'chishev lo akrein es michsas ha'elkocho ad shnas hayovel. So it means that it's an erech k'moi shekotzu b'Torah, and that's where the Rambam feels comfortable in Kuf Yud Zayin and quoting only one pasuk and saying a v'chulei of a goymer, that really stay miknosai is also ke'erech hakosa b'Torah. And then I'll add another thing, and maybe the Torah itself, he learned, is stressing that it's what you call fikah. If you recall, in Shorish Zayin, the Ram says if you have tanoim, a tanoim, that, for example, in Korban Oil V'Yoreh, the Torah says that if it's Ashiris, it's like this. V'im dalhu, and if it's dali dalus, v'im, then it's something else. So if it's this way, and it's im this way, and in that way. So im is really, the Torah is telling you, it's the same mitzvah expressed itself in a different way under different circumstances. So since the Torah over here said, let's read it. It says like this: V'im mister chuzoso yaktish ish l'Hashem v'oyak v'lechizaroi zera choymes b'chamishim shoker b'kesef. That's in Chav Zayin Tez Zayin. And then in Chav Beis it says, Im mishnas hayovel yaktish sodeu ke'elka choyokum v'im estei miknosei asher lo mistei achuzo yaktish l'Hashem. So it's in im v'im. And im is all different expressions. It's what you call fikah of the same mitzvah. So the Ram has a gilu in the parasha that these different dinim are meaningless, and he's of the opinion that since it's all the erech HaTorah, Torah just said in this situation the erech is like this, the same way that the Ram will tell you in Erkei Odom, that is Zochar, if he's this age has this, and this age has that, and the cave of this age this, and this age that, it doesn't make it separate mitzvahs and all the expression of Erkei Odom. Here, it's all an expression of Erkei Sadis. That's what I think the Ram will tell you. And that's why the Ram goes out of his way here and says, he starts it off, Vuhu amroi v'im mistei achuzosai, v'goyme v'im estei miknosa, asher loi misadeilach mistei achuzosai. V'don mistei achuzosai, it says, in this case, the erech is mo'oyal cholafi zaroi, ubestei miknosa v'chishlu hakoyin es michsas el kocho. And it's all one mitzvah. Then the Rambam sets up a new principle. And the principle is like this. He says, V'ein roi sheyimnu mine ha'elchim kulam mitzvah achas kmo sheyimdu mine ha'korbonos kulam mitzvah achas. V'zeh muvur im ha'istaklos. Everyone should understand this. So the Rambam bases his argument on mini korbanos. The same way you agree to me that mini korbanos are separate mitzvahs. Similarly, mine elchen are separate mitzvahs. Now, you have to ask yourself, what does he mean by mini korbanos? So you could have had two options. I'll discuss both of them, and I'll think. I would assume that it's more one than the other. We'll see. One option is they were talking about from Mitzvas Aseh Samach Gimel to Samach Vov. It means Mitzvas Oilo, Mitzvahs Chatos, Mitzvahs Osham, and Mitzvahs Zevach HaShlomim. Okay? And that's Mine HaKorbanos Kulam, as he says in Akdama, that basically all Korbanos are subsumed under these four categories. That's what he says in Akdama to Zvachim, and he says it very clearly in Mitzvah Samach Vov. So the interesting thing is, the Rambam in Shiur Yud Beis, when he talks about these mitzvahs, he's very careful, and he says, and he's explaining not why they are four separate mitzvahs, but why the many parts of each one of them are not separate mitzvahs. And he says, in the Oila, there's a Shrita and a Zrika and the Haktoras Habosa, and he has a very strange thing, but whatever he has, and the Dine and the Oila or Ha'oila, they're basically, each one of them, Chatas is peculiar dinim. He talks about Mikashtifa, among other things. And Oshim has its peculiar dinim, and Zevach HaShlomim has its peculiar dinim. So, therefore, he says the conglomerate of each of the peculiar dinim, so you don't look at the Shechita and the Zrika and the whole, each the Seder and Aktorah or the Hakrova as separate mitzvahs. We look at the whole Seder as Maisa Oila, Maisa Chatos, Maisa Osham, and Maisa Zevach HaShlomim. However, he never explains to us why don't we count all four of these mitzvahs as one mitzvah. In fact, the Ramban clearly says that if you would ask him, he says there should be one. And that's what he says in the Asogas Yud Beis. V'akol ve'elai yoseh shedimne kol ma'isa korbanos achas ein hefesh lekoin ben shias chatos v'oshem oila u'shlomim v'nitztavo kol zera aroin ve'avoidosam mitzvah achas hinemo v'avartem oisam v'avartem avoides matona etenes kunaschem yitzaloimo tavdu b'chol avoides hakohanim. And he discusses avoides matona, which is not negate us. So you understand, you could have had this argument. Interesting, the Ramban himself doesn't accept this argument, but he says at the end, if you can accept this argument, then v'im kein yachsu arba mitzvos mecheshboinoi shel Rabba kan, you knock all out the mitzvahs. So the Ramban himself is not misalik them in his cheshbon at the end of Sefer mitzvahs, whatever it is. There's certainly an issue. Why does the Ram clearly, why is it 4 mitzvahs? So, I would assume this is where the Ram is coming from. The Ram assumes that it's certainly separate mitzvahs because they have dinim shonim. There are 4 different categories which are groups of dinim which express 4 different akovos. There's akova from oilo, akova from chatos, and akova from osham, and akova from zevach shlomim. And therefore, there are 4 mitzvahs. And similarly, in Erchin, there are different dinim in each of the Erchin, and therefore the 4 separate mitzvahs. That, I think, is his comparison. Or, I think that's what you should say. And it's interesting that there's nowhere the Ram clearly says why it's 4 separate mitzvahs. He only says why each mitzvah by itself is not separate mitzvahs. The mitzvah should be the shchita, the akrova, the zrika. That's what he says he's having polemics about. But it's like divrei Torah neim mokum echad. He's telling you the side of why these are separate mitzvahs based on a principle. In other words, this principle is a known principle, and this is the reason why Erchin is 4 mitzvahs. It is never told you this principle. And you can only ascertain this principle by logical reasoning. If A is equal to B and A has this, then B is also like that. And it's also separate deed. That is very strange, right? So that's what's going on over here. There's another way of doing this. And assuming that he's referring to Sherish Yudalid, that the various mine korbanos of Einshim, the Maise, the Chatas Kovua, Oshem Vadai, Oshem Tolui, Oshem Vadai, and Korbanot V'Yored. Mine korbanos is a little bit odd. Mine korbanos, I understand in all the different types of korbanos, even though the Torah actually says the word korban by each one of them except by Oshem. And also another problem, not only that it's not the equation is not exact, but there's another problem over here. Besides the equation not being exact, the Rambam gives reasons in Sherish Yudalid, and they are not really symmetrical. They're not parallel to the reasons that he's mentioning over here. He mentions over there in Sherish Yudalid, he mentions 2 reasons. He says, because the avonos which are mechayiv, these different types of korbanos of chatos, kavua, oshem tolui, oshem vadai, and korban oiled, are different. I'm not sure you can call that different dinim. That's very odd. And then he says that each one has a separate parasha b'fnei atzma, which is not what he's presenting over here. The problem over here is not the question whether it's a parasha b'fnei atzma in terms of its relationship to Eirchin. The issue is whether there are different dinim in the parashas. So I would assume the better way to go is to assume he's referring to the Dalet Sugi Karbonos. But frankly, I'm not 100% sure, but I think we should leave it at that. Here, just an aside, I'm not sure what this means. And I didn't understand what it is in Samach Vov. The Rambam makes a very important point, and what he thinks is an important point, he has a sentence or two about it, that these Dalet Sugi Karbonos are a reflection of all Karbonos. And that's what he goes, and therefore there's something going on. What that means, I don't know, and why that's important over here. It is true in the Hakadoma to Zvachim, when you're trying to set up organization principles about Karbonos, you want to know the four main archetypes of Karbonos. You say that it's all the Karbonos. But when you're discussing Minyan HaMitzvos, what the heck, what difference does it make? The issue is the Ma'aseh Chatos one mitzvah, many mitzvahs? The Ma'aseh Oila one mitzvah, many mitzvahs? But whether if Chatos, Oila, Osham, and Zevach Shlomim, all four of them together are an expression of all different types of Karbonos and not l'chayr, that should be irrelevant. And he does it there, and he does it over here. Look, K'mo shelo yimnu mine Karbonos kulam. And that's what he does, the same thing in Eilchin. Mine ho-Eilchin kulam. You could have called it one mitzvah. You don't call it one mitzvah. I don't know. I don't understand that 100%. I'm just telling you the facts. Now, next. Comes the Rambam, mitzvah kufiyut ches. HaMitzvah hashmone esrei umeya. He shetzivonu sheyeh kol hanehene min hahektish. That's a moil. Nehene min hahektish. O oichel kodesh kloi mahatruma. So the two options. There's nehene min hahektish, which is moil, and there's oichel kodesh, which is truma. Okay, and then he says bishgoga. I think there should be a comma here before bishgoga, and bishgoga refers to both moil and to a tashlumei truma, because both moil and tashlumei truma only have tesefes chomesh in the case of shoygeg. Mishalem mashe ochol, which is referring to truma, o shir mashe nehne, but tesefes chomesh. It means keren plus chomesh. That's the mitzvah. V'hu amra yisale v'es asher chota min hakodesh yishalem es chamishi soy olav, and this is tashlumei mila. V'omar, now he's referring to tashlumei truma, gam kein v'ish ki yochel kodesh bishkoga. Ukva hisboru mishpatei mitzvah b'meseches meila u'b'meseches truma gam kein. It's an amazing thing. A priori, two separate mitzvahs, tashlumei mila and tashlumei truma, and he puts it together as one. And the mitzvah is mishalem mashe ochal o shir mashe nene v'tesefes chomesh. So l'chayra, the two separate tzivuyim here. V'yesa shechotem en hakodesh yishalem v'chamish so yoisiv olav by Mila. V'yomah gam kein v'ish kiyach hakodesh b'shkogo. And what's he going to do? He has to be shalom ken v'chomish. Separate mitzvahs. So in Shirish Yudalid, he says something. He says like this: Ein loy livnois hamodas hagadolim, I guess oinshim, b'mitzvah achas, b'chulei v'ulam achelik shebia boy hadin yesh boy amitz yesh min amitzvos haheim mashisivono yisal sheniskol ba'avonim mishiavu aleim v'chulei, and the southern mitzvahs have this onish and that onish. And then it continues as mehem mashisivono yisale shena'anish ho'eve aleihem b'memoinoi levad loy begufoi tzich onish momen kimoi shekonas begazlan teisefes hachoimesh uvageinev tashlumi kefil. So there's a separate mitzvah of the einish of tashlumi choimesh. The same way there's a mitzvah, the einish of skila, and the einish of chenek, and the einish of malchus. There's a separate mitzvah called the einish of tashlumi choimesh by Gaza. So then, if you would work like that, you would have said that by Goslin, you should have put Goslin, Mi'ila, and True B'Shoigeg as one mitzvah and call it the Einish V'Chomish. The odd thing is that the Rambam in Kuf Sadi Daled, he says like this, and I say Kuf Sadi Daled. It's a separate I say, meaning a mitzvahs. He should zivonu lahoshav as a gzela, bi'atzmo, im hi nisheres ba'atzmo, means be'en, v'tesefes chomesh, oy lo says domeo. So this tesefes chomesh, which he has set down the principle, and shows you Dalit that it's a separate mitzvah, the Einish HaChomish, he puts it and hides it away in the middle of the Heshav Zegzela Shegos. And he clearly separates Tesefes Chomish of Gezela from Tesefes Chomish of Me'ila and Tchum. The Rambam, especially if you'd assume that the mitzvah is the Einish Chomish, okay, the Rambam's stress over here is very odd. Shetzivonu shiyeh kol hanenim min hahektish or ochel kodesh. The Rambam stresses that some type of hano from kodesh is mechayvet tesefes chomish. In Me'ila it's hano, and in Truma, it's achila, and it's also b'shkoga. In Gazlan, the chiyuv keren b'chomish, it's nothing to do with shoygei, could be mazed. So he's going out of his way to say one simple thing. He's trying to put, he's not doing over here something like Yudalid and saying that there's an einish of Tesefes Chomish and everything that falls into that category is one mitzvah. But he's saying that with the categories of mitzvahs, that mitzvahs determined by Inyonei HaTeira, as he says very clearly in Shiur Tes, he's saying that Nene min HaKedesh Bishkogo and Eichel Truma, which is Kedesh Bishkogo, is all one Inyan of the Torah, and Tashlume Kedesh of Keren V'Chomish is one mitzvah. And that's what he's trying to do. And that's very interesting. It's a whole new approach. Nothing to do with Einish. So this could then, you could say that the Rambam is very careful in Shiur Dalet and says Teisefes Chomish of Gezela. It's only Gezela that you can have this issue of an Einish and a Chiyuv and a separate mitzvah b'teres Einish, but Keren V'Chomish of Truma and Mila is a whole different story. We're going to evaluate this and we'll see about it. Believe it. The interesting thing over here is to look at Mishnah Torah, how the Ram looks at the Mitzvahs Mila and Teisefes Chomish, what's going on in Truma Teisefes Chomish, and what's going on in Gezela in Teisefes Chomish. Comes the Rambam and is almost diametrically opposed to what he did in Minyan HaMitzvos. Because in Minyan HaMitzvos, he's trying to find a common denominator between Achilas Truma, B'Shgoy Shoigeg, and Nenem and Achilas B'Shoigeg to make it all one mitzvah. And the Ram clearly in Mishnah Torah is making the mitzvah called Din HaMoyel. And somehow the Tashlume Truma falls by the wayside. We have no clue what happened to it. Let's just follow the steps here. Comes the Rambam in the beginning of Protei Mitzvahs in Hilchos Mila. In Hilchos Truma there's nothing there. In Hilchos Mila he says, L'shalem hamoyel asher chota b'teisefes chomish v'korban v'zehu din hamoyel. So there's no mitzvah of teisefes chomish. The teisefes chomish is a chelik of the mitzvah called din hamoyel, which includes teisefes chomish of Mila and also Osham Vadai. And the amazing thing is that you count Osham Vadai twice, because Osham Vadai is a separate mitzvah called an Einish, or whatever you want to call it, in the beginning of Choshkogos, and he has the Chatzis Kavua, the Osham Vadai, the Osham Tolui, and the Korban Orbiyot, separate mitzvahs, and he has a mitzvah called Din HaMoyel, which includes the Teisefes, the Keren V'Teisefes Chomish, and the Korban. Okay, say whatever it is, that's what it is. It's a very odd thing. And he does the same thing. And you get the impression in Hilchos Mila Perek Aleph Halacha Gimel, Moal Bishkogo, Mishalem Ma Shenene V'Teisefes Chomish, Umevi Ayil B'Shnei Sloim, Umakrivoy Osho, Umiskapeloi, V'Zeo Aniko Asher Milois, Shene'emar V'Chota Bishkogo Mikot Hashem V'Hevies Hashomo. It's a mitzvah to bring an Oshom V'Goyme V'Eis Asher Chota Min HaKodesh Yishalem V'Es Chamishisos. You have to pay Keren and Chomish. V'shilum hakeren b'teisefes chomesh im havas korban Mitzvas Aseh. This whole conglomerate is a mitzvah. Again, the same thing. In Hilchos Shumos, he goes like this. There's no mention in Pratei Mitzvahs, Hilchos Shumos. He mentions the Chiyuv Chomesh in Hilchos Shumos, but no mention there's a mitzvah about anything. And to say that it's part of its milah is a little bit odd. And the intuitive and the logical, the rational thing to say, there's no relationship. The way he sets up that he puts Hilchos Truma and Hilchos Shumos, the din Kerem v'Chomesh, and he calls the mitzvah din hamoyel. There's no relationship between the two. In Perek Vav of Hilchos Shumos, Halacha Vav, he says like this: Zar she'ochel truma b'zadai bein shehoye tomei bein shehoye tov bein she'ochel truma tahira bein she'ochel truma tameya chay mislei shamayim shenema umeis bo yichalu. That's amazing. That's very reasonable. Ve'eno mishalim demei ma she'ochel she'en loko mishalim. Ochal bishkogo moisif chomesh shenema v'ish ki yochal kodesh bishkogo v'yosef chamishas. She quotes a pasuk, which is a mitzvah, and he doesn't count them in mitzvahs. It doesn't go anywhere. An amazing, amazing phenomenon. He doesn't go as far, this is an aside, as the Bahag that the Ram is cheshid him in Sherish Yadalid to count the Oynish and the Ashora as two separate mitzvahs. And the Ram says that's an impossibility. In Sherish Yadalid, his Balbo Zulosenu, the Sherish has this Bilbo, Shein Tzorach Hoshevala, and Ki'ilu, he counts the Oynish of Shabbos and the Ashora of Asiyas V'loch as two separate mitzvahs. He didn't do that. But even to assume that it's one mitzvah, how do you assume that the pratim of an ashora are subsumed on the ashora and not counted as a mitzvah aseh? What does all this mean? You could suggest the reason why the Rambam has moved away from Sefer HaMitzvos is because the Rambam is clearly saying that the kapora of the Kerem v'Chomesh is not a separate kapora, but it's part of Kapolas Osham. That's what he's trying to do. Once you're ready to accept that postulate, that it's part of Kapolas Osham, so then l'chayr has to do with Truma. If you say that it's a mechaper, a separate mechaper, or separate oynish for achilas kodesh b'shkoga, or nenem HaKadosh b'shkoga, you can say that it's all one mitzvah. But if it merges together as part of the kapora of the korban osham, so then l'chayra, there's no place to merge it together with tashlumei truma. That's what I would say. I don't understand what he does with tashlumei truma, but I understand why he doesn't merge them together. And then it's also not clear in Minyan HaMitzvos to say that Tashlumei Keren v'Chomesh is a kapora. Because the Rambam quotes the Tashlumin as ki'ilu oinshim for the lavin. In fact, if you look in Mitzvas Aseh, because the Rambam clearly says in the minyan, in Akdoma to Minyan HaMitzvah after Shorish Yudalid, he says that wherever there is an oynish, he's going to mention it. In the Asor, v'oiva al zeh chayiv misa, or kores, or korban, kach v'kach, or malchus, or achas misas bezin, or tashlumin. V'chol ma shelo yeskor bo gedem and agadorim teida, that it's a mitzvah aseh and there's no oynish on it. So it means wherever there's going to be an oynishness asor, he's going to mention it. So what does he do? In Lois Aseh Kuf Lamed Gimel, it says, he says here, kol zar me'achal kol truma, v'u amroi, kol zar lo yochal kodesh. V'im ochal truma b'jolgen chayiv misle shomayim, v'enu chayiv tesefes choymish ela b'shoigig. So the tesefes choymish is an einish for the ashora b'shoigig of achilas truma. Similarly, in Kuf Mem Vav, he says like this. Hish se his halno me'achol bosa ho'ilo. V'omer yisala lo sucha lecho b'shorecho. Dorecho. And he does an amazing thing. The ashora of achilas oilo and the ashora of moil is one ashora in Minyan HaMitzvos. And then he says, v'oiva alav zeh kloima sheyochel b'sar ho'oilo oh shiene mishar kochim shechayam aleim mila kmo sheizbar b'sechas mila imo yemezid loike v'im ho'yeshoigeg Yaakov korban mila v'yishalim mashenene v'yosef chomesh kmo sheizbar b'sechas mila. So it seems to be an oynish, and so you can say that it's a very similar oynish because the oynish of kodesh and shoigeg, therefore it's one mitzvah. But we understand Mishnah Torah is a whole different world, and we have no clue of what happened to Tashlumi Truma in Mishnah Torah. Now, just want to tell you, in short, because we'll come back to it, Mitzvah Hashem, when we get to the mitzvah, the Rambam Mishnah Torah does not put Tashlume Chomesh of Gzeila under the mitzvah V'heshiv, because he talks about V'heshiv in Perik Aleph, in Perik Beis V'Gzeila. There's no mention there of Chomesh. He mentions it, talks it later in Hilchos Gzeila when he talks about the Osham in Perik Zayin Aloch Aleph and Beis. He talks about Chomesh, Keren Chomesh in Gzeila. You get the impression in Mishnah Torah that it's really in Hilchos Shavuos, because the Rambam has like this in Perik Aleph Halacha Tes Shavuos Epikodoin Halacha Ches and Tes Ketzad Kol Mi Sheyesh Lei Momon Biyodei Me'Pikodoin Me'Milvo Gazan V'Chuli V'Chuli Geizim V'Tobim Men HaMomon V'Kofer How Is It Oiv V'Leises Shnemo V'Leises Sechachashu Zu Ashol El Kafius Momon This Ashol Kafius Momon V'im nishba loy al sheker al moment shekof al izeh oive belav acher v'al zeh lo yise shakro ishba misa zu as hol nishba kfius moment u'shvu zu hi anik v'shvuos pikodem u'ma hu chayiv al shvuos pikodem sheshoka bo mishalim es hakeren shekofa bo im tesefes chomesh u'makriv oshom v'adai ben shoy yemez ben shoy shnem v'chichash v'amisa v'chulei. What mitzvah is this? It's a part of Osham. He calls it Shavuos. Is it an Oynish for the Ashol, or Shakul, or Sechachashu? Then it's very similar to Truma. And then it's not counted at all. We don't have, it's very what he's doing in Tesefes Gzeila, which he has as a separate mitzvah, Minyan HaMitzvos. Not Minyan, in Shorish Yudalid, he puts it in Minyan HaMitzvos as part of the V'heshiv, and in Mishnah Torah, he tucks it away in the lav of Lo Yisachashu and Lo Yisachakro, which is an amazing thing. It's almost the same fate of Tashlumi Truma. We have no clue of what happened. So, have a nice week.